I'm here with Sachit Kamat, the Chief Product Officer at Eightfold AI, who is going to explain how to align talent and AI strategies to business outcomes. Sachit, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Dan, for having me on your show.
So I'm curious, can you explain a little bit more about your role at Eightfold?
Yeah, so I'm a product person, right? So my job is to basically build the future of the technology that the company basically puts out there in the market. And so, I get to work with engineers, with product people, with designers, to basically build out the things that customers want. And so my job is to understand the trends in the market and effectively work with customers to put out roadmaps as well as the current iteration of the product. And I spend a lot of time working with folks within the company to try and basically put the best things out there that people actually want to use, as well as to solve real business problems that they're facing.
Yeah, and as someone who's looking at all these trends, obviously AI is, I guess you could call it the great buzzword of the past 1+ year at this point. What trends are you seeing in AI, and how does that factor into how you think about your products?
So I have to say, like the last year, from what I have been observing in the industry, for me personally, has been like the most exciting year, right, in my entire career. And I think the primary reason is you can start to see at the finish line, like the light at the end of the tunnel, right, where effectively a lot of the things that we do today manually are going to be completely automated, right? So you see this like massive excitement for AI, particularly with generative AI just completely sort of dominating the airwaves in terms of what we're hearing about. But there is a lot of reality behind it, right, in terms of sort of the ability to use generative AI with workflow automation, as well as effectively some of the vertical AI that's been built over the last couple of years. When you start putting all these building blocks together, you can start to do things that obviously like humans are doing today, but you can also imagine a future where you can do things that were not human scalable before, right? And I'll use an example here. One of the things that recruiters have to do quite often is to reach out to candidates and get them interested in positions that they're hiring for, right? Now, a typical recruiter will probably reach out to 10 or 20 people during the course of a day. Now, with technology and with generative AI and some of the automation that I just mentioned, it is actually possible to reach out to thousands of people in a personalized fashion every single day, right? And that is not a human scalable thing today. So those are the kinds of things that I, as a technologist, get super, super excited by, because this fundamentally changes the game, right? Of what is possible out there with the current iteration of technology, and bringing that to market. For me, I'm just super excited by it.
Yeah, and I think for sure the scalability and the efficiencies that a company would benefit from with AI, I mean, that is one of, if not the biggest thing. And whether workers like to admit it or not, there's a lot of work they do on a daily basis, namely administrative type work, that they don't want to do, and they'd love to get rid of it. So I think it's definitely a kind of a win-win for employees and employers. How could organizations become more agile to be able to make fast-moving market changes in today's fast-paced, dynamic, disruptive business environment?
So, we are, as a company, going through this transformation ourselves, right, at the moment. So if you just look at sort of the tools that are available out there in the marketplace, the technologies that are available, I think the first thing is you have to have a culture of innovation, right? So when you start seeing a better way to do some certain things, right? So whether it is a sales process or a capability that impacts like a particular function within the organization, to actually have a culture of experimentation, right? Which is, you don't necessarily want to adopt something and then deploy it to thousands of people before you actually can validate that it works, experimentally for a certain like portion of the organization. So we as an organization are always experimenting with new tools and new technologies. And some of these things, what you find is, they're absolutely scalable, right? You should stop doing the things that you are doing manually today and completely transform the way that you operate, right? And one example that I'll use is like our marketing team has been experimenting with different generative AI tools. And now, one of the things that they have learned is that they can actually create marketing copy for campaigns, et cetera, using some of these tools. And we have now fundamentally changed the way that the marketing function operates. So, there are always things that from a culture perspective that it takes to actually make that transformation happen. And particularly when you're talking about some of the largest, companies on the planet, they're going to have to, basically do this in a way that doesn't disrupt what they do today, right? So yeah, I would say it starts with a culture of experimentation, a culture of, being open to trying new things. And then when you do learn that there is a more efficient, more transformative way to actually operate, you adopt that and you scale that across the organization.
I think the cultural aspect is really important. It doesn't get talked about enough because there's still fears around AI. How do I use it? Will this take my job? Whether it's full-time workers or especially even hourly workers would resist it, especially once you start reading all these headlines of the robots are taking over corporate America and your jobs. Be fearful, right? And so I think that the cultural component is really important for making people feel safe, secure, and equipping them with the knowledge on how to use it, right? It's not like people went to college and there were AI classes 4 years ago, right? So this is something new, and there's a little bit of a skills gap that needs to be filled.
Absolutely.
And do you really think that AI can deliver on all the promises that we hear in the news media and ones that you hope to kind of execute with your product roadmap long term?
So I am a believer in the technology, primarily because like I've seen the potential of it, sort of in its early phases, right, of what is possible. I still think that we're very much in the foundational like innings of the technology, right? So in the sense that what will be possible maybe 6 months from now is, you know, uh, like I think will transform certain things that people thought were not possible before. And then, a couple of years from now, we will get to a phase where it does deliver on like the true promise of what we are imagining at the moment, right? And then a few years from now, I would say we will run into applications that are very difficult to imagine today. So the scale at which the technology is transforming, the way, sort of the industry is responding, the new use cases that are being built, I am personally super, super excited by them. And I think, particularly when you look at the HR domain, there are use cases that we will come up with over the next couple of years that we just thought weren't possible before. So, yeah, personally, as a technologist, again, like I said, this is the most exciting time to be innovating.
Yeah, and you're looking at it across the whole employee life cycle in every HR application. It's really going to affect everything. And that's just HR. I mean, it extends way beyond HR. I think it's going to affect 100% of jobs, not even just the estimated, 60 or so percent. I think it's actually every single job is either transforms your job or transforms something around you, and you'll have to react to that. Speaking about, so of course, we're talking about efficiencies, we're talking about culture. But what about the executive team, even the CEO? Like, how can they prepare for an AI-driven workplace?
So I think we have started to see this over the last year, right? So, basically, once generative AI sort of came to the fore, it first started out with the CEO, asking their leadership teams, right? What should we be doing to adopt this technology? How can we transform the culture of the company? How can we, effectively adopt some of this technology to, drive the metrics that the executive team cares about, right? Whether it is a cost reduction or whether it is basically a scaling of on the, sort of the positive side of, creating new value, right, that the company couldn't do before. I think that is now translated, it's gone from the CEO and the board down to each of the functional leaders within companies, and they have tried to figure out what are the tools and technologies they should be adopting to actually drive the metrics and the outcomes that they care about. And like, the example that I just provided on the marketing side, right, that we've adopted here at Eightfold, or, for example, our sales team is using a number of these generative AI tools now when it comes to capturing conversations, learning from the questions that are being asked, being able to analyze, the most common questions that come up in sales conversations. I just think that every single function can benefit from, the technology that's out there to actually scale what we do today in a much, much more efficient way in the future, right? And so, yeah, I obviously get to work on this technology on an everyday basis, right? So in terms of building out the future of what HR looks like in a AI powered and a generative AI powered world. And honestly, like the types of applications that we're building, I get really, really excited by, because I do think that in the future, when you look at the way that recruiters operate, that, people that manage talent in companies operate, 6 months from now, it's going to look very different from the way that they operate today. And, it is really, really exciting. So I think the core thing is for every single leader to start evaluating, right? Is there a benefit to adopting some of these technologies? Like what is the low hanging fruit that they should be experimenting with? And then once they've experimented and evaluated the benefits, actually transform them into things that change the way that the organization operates. And in some cases, you may find that there are things that you didn't think that were possible before, right? Given constraints that we operate with in terms of budgets, et cetera, they're now actually possible today. So those are the kinds of things I would say that leaders should be thinking about as they evaluate the technologies that are out there.
And those constraints might be lifted because of AI, thus enabling you to scale and do other things and have more applications using that technology.
Yeah, and just to give you one example of that, right? So then this is the innovation that Eightfold brought to the market, right? So, when we launched, 5 or 6 years ago, the core application that we came out with was the ability to use AI to analyze, millions of resumes in 2 seconds or less, and then effectively show the recruiter, the top 50 or 100 candidates that could be a fit for a particular role, right? So that was transformative back then. Now what is possible is obviously like taking it to the next level, right? Which is not only can you surface the right people, but you can message them in an automated fashion. You can effectively get them interested in roles. You can start to do a lot of the types of manual tasks that recruiters have been struggling with, right, to do at scale. And yeah, a lot of things that were not possible before are now possible today.
Because without that type of technology, you'll have someone like me who just hired someone. And, in today's economy, there's an abundant amount of job seekers applying for jobs. I reviewed personally like 800 applications in 5 days to then find and go through that two people to then hire someone the following Monday. So it did happen quick, way, way, way faster than like most organizations. Obviously, we're really small, but still, it's like, can there be this additional kind of AI filtering system to save all of that time I spent? It was like a full-time job within a week to then get to the potential end result or a better result than what I had.
Yeah, and some companies, they have to deal with not sometimes 800, but sometimes 8,000,
Yeah.
80,000 applications sometimes for positions, right? And that is just not a human scalable thing to do today, right? So that is one of the reasons why the technology was built. And it's a clear example of, the power of what is possible, in a world where you use AI, right? Where humans aren't able to do certain things, just given, sort of our attention spans, the fact that we get tired, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. And what are the ethical considerations that executives have to think about when buying and implementing any AI technology?
So what I would say is that there's a lot of regulation coming in the AI space, right? I think the EU has launched its, obviously the AI Act that is being formulated. You've had, jurisdictions like New York that are regulating, effectively the ethical use of AI when it comes to hiring, et cetera, right? That have sort of come out there, and the rules of the road are, I would say, like starting to be set, right? But I think what a lot of corporations can do today is, number one, effectively establish the basic principles, right, with which they evaluate AI software. There are, certain things that you need to consider around, the way the technology is being used, the type of data that's being used, how user privacy and other considerations are taken into account. You don't want to end up in a world where the AI is misused to effectively get to a place where you scale human bias, right? So one of the things with recruiting, and the reason why we have all these organizations in the United States that are regulating you know uh, HR practices, is because there were a lot of like bad things that happened in the past, right? And we as a company, Eightfold as a company, definitely wants to work closely with regulators to do the right thing, right? Because the power of AI is you can actually scale doing the right thing in a way that actually benefits all parties, right? So the corporation as well as the individual. So for the individual, the ability to be considered for a role, right, even if there are 80,000 applicants, is a win, right? In the sense that if they have the right background, they should be surfaced, closer to the top in that list. And then for the corporation, you do want to make sure that you are considering the best applicants, right? Regardless of, sort of their backgrounds and whether they're from a protected class or not from a protected class, et cetera. All these considerations come into the fore, and you do want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And I think technology can actually be an enabler, right, to make sure that corporations are doing the right thing. But a lot of it just comes down to, effectively establishing what are the rules of the road, making sure that you have the best practices in place. And as regulation is changing, the technology being able to adapt to it. So any software provider or AI provider that you are working with today, you do want to make sure that, number one, they are adhering to the best practices and principles that are best in class today. And I think one of the other things that I have seen is corporations are creating ethical AI boards, right? That effectively they're looking at when they evaluate vendors that are out there, and companies that they're trying to do business with. So some of this is still developing, but what I would say is that these best practices are out there for adoption.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like standards and practices, like whether you're the technology company that's supplying companies with some sort of AI solution, or whether you're that company that's kind of fielding those solutions to see what's going to work best. And it's like a running document, like you're saying, like, give this like a few years, things could look completely different, and you need to evolve those practices, procedures, and those regulations will evolve too. Like no one knows the future, but if you do the right thing today and hold to that and be accountable, that's going to set you up regardless of what happens.
Absolutely.
So I think that's an important message. And how can all these leaders optimize their costs and investments for business growth? And what role does AI have in that?
Yeah. So just to take again an example from the world of HR, right? So if you just think about it today, if you have a recruiter that's operating like in a completely technology, devoid of technology in some fashion, right? So they would typically spend their day probably 80% or so on completely operational tasks, right? So which is, effectively screening resumes, effectively, reaching out to people in a manual fashion, trying to schedule interviews, and a number of other operational things out there, right? So one of the things that leaders need to do is to evaluate which of these manual processes can be automated by technology, right? And so, obviously, companies like us can help with some of these manual processes because the AI and the technology is capable of automating, I would say, a good chunk of some of these operational tasks, right? But one thing it doesn't do today is actually replace the human judgment that we need, right? So obviously, you don't want to adopt a world where the automation gets to a level where it does things that effectively require human judgment. So I would say the right way to think about it is to evaluate any business process, to think about the things that are purely manual, operational, repeatable, and can potentially be automated using technology, and then obviously identify the things that obviously makes humans unique, right, in our abilities, and effectively like take those processes and obviously like protect them from basically just trying to reduce cost when it comes to those things that humans are much better at. So and to use some examples again from the recruiting world, right, like you definitely don't want AI to basically determine who to hire, right, as an example. Like that is not number one is it would be illegal to do that just given regulation that exists in the space. uh, and two, like I think that is it takes away humans from what we do best, right, which is we have judgment on some of the things that are not measurable today about people. So that would be an example where you do want to take into account some of the best practices, as well as you want to take into account the things that machines are better at, right, which is for example, going through tens of millions of resumes and figuring out who are the right people that potentially you should consider. But you don't want it to get to a point where you press a button and you hire someone, right? That is what I would say is an example of going too far.
Yeah, and I don't even think it would work out well, right? What you're describing is the relationship between human and machine, that partnership in the workplace, how technology augments and supports and supplements what humans are doing, making their lives easier. But I also think like if you're hiring someone, there's still the personality component, the interrelational component is so important that like if you don't talk to anyone throughout the entire process and they pop in, come to your office or work remote on that Monday, like there's no rapport built. It could be kind of not only challenging but really risky.
Absolutely, right. And so yeah, it's a great example, right? I do see a future where machines and humans are working in harmony with each other, right, to make each other better. And that is kind of the at in the short run, that is the future that I foresee, given the technologies that are being built, right? So it's not that far away. In fact, it's already in practice, right, across a lot of corporations in the world, and I think it'll continue to grow as we move forward.
Yeah, and one of the things you like to talk about is the role of the CHRO and the partnership with the CIO. I think that's so relevant in today's world, especially coming out of COVID, when the CHRO, like everyone was like, oh, what's our kind of COVID strategy? What's our remote work strategy? So there's such a spotlight on, heads of HR and even their direct reports. And now with this whole conversation of AI, especially when it comes to talent development, recruiting, and all these different HR functions, technology is a big component of what they do. So that relationship between CIO and CHRO is so critical. Can you describe, how they can both work together to have more positive outcomes, and why that relationship you think is so valuable?
We've seen this a lot in our customer base, right? Which is the CIO and the CHRO actually partnering to solve like real problems that companies are facing. I'll actually start with a story, right? So, the company I was at before coming to Eightfold was Uber, and it went through a pretty massive transformation, right? Because when COVID ended up happening, and basically people stopped moving from point A to point B, which was the core business of the company had to innovate very, very rapidly, right? And effectively, all of the business sort of volume started shifting over to Uber Eats, because people were at home and they were pressing a button and trying to order food so that they could, effectively like get through their day, right? During COVID, it was a very, very interesting time, and to see a business at the scale of Uber transform overnight was a very, very difficult thing to do, right? And you definitely saw situations where the technology sometimes was just not up to scratch, right, in terms of the skills of people and the ability to transform the skills in a very short amount of time. And I think the CIO and the chief people officer at the time like definitely had to collaborate a lot, right, to understand, could you move people from effectively sort of the jobs that they were doing before on one side of the business to the other side of the business. And effectively, like I would say that that's an example of a very rapid transformation, right? Most transformations are not that rapid, but it is definitely a sign of our times, right? Which is, we've seen economic cycles get much shorter. We've seen situations where companies have to adopt very, very rapidly to changes in the external environments, with things shifting very dramatically. And I think that's a scenario where the CIO and the CHRO definitely need to collaborate, right? So figuring out what technologies need to be in place, thinking about sort of what are the deployment cycles of some of these technologies. And then the CIO has a certain expertise as well, right, in terms of figuring out, privacy, some of the standards when it comes to adopting technology, making sure that the right controls are in place. That's the expertise that the CIO brings, and then the CHRO can bring the perspective of, what do we need to solve from a people perspective, right? What should the people at the company be capable of? What's the data that they need to make the right decisions? And so definitely, as technology has sort of scaled in the space, you definitely see that partnership between the two functions really, really being key for companies to survive and thrive in all of the change, given all the changes that we've seen in the macro environment.
And one of the things that, Eightfold focuses on and you talk about is the skills gap and the importance of kind of assessing the skills you have within the organization, and enabling employees to kind of move within in a more of a fluid way within the organization based on skill, need, and all of these different things, and shift skills and upskill. How can the C-suite, though, specifically assess if they have the current talent and skills that they need to compete now in the future?
Yeah, so Eightfold has a very, I would say, sort of developed view on this space, right? Because we've been operating what we call the talent intelligence platform in this space, which was, effectively built for this particular use case, right? Which was for helping companies understand, what are the skills of the employees that they have today, really understanding, what employees are capable of learning, right? As in terms of expanding their skill sets, and then connecting them to the tools and the abilities where they can actually continue to grow those skill sets, right? Whether it is coursework, whether it is mentorship, or whether it is, effectively experiential learning that can happen at the company. And so when you start to show the data, right, in terms of where people are today, sort of where they are growing, and you start to show that data to the functional leaders as well as the CEO at the company, you start to have a very clear understanding of the capabilities at the level of the company, the level of the, sort of sometimes a business unit or a new capability that the company is trying to build. And that then, can result in effectively, helping the company make decisions on where they need to invest next, right? Sometimes the answer is bringing in people from the outside that have a particular expertise. Sometimes the answer is, helping the company transform by investing in, growing the people that you already have. But I think that the future definitely looks like, a data driven organization that has a very deep understanding of the skill sets of people, and then uses that data to make decisions on in terms of where it wants to go in the future. And that is a core belief of folks at Eightfold, right? Which is, that's the problem that we think every company in the world should be solving.
I think I 100% agree. I think every company has to, like, the data that companies have now, they didn't have that like 10, 20 years ago. So there's almost no excuses, but it's also smart to get ahead of all these trends like we were talking about earlier in this conversation. It's, hey, you're you're going to head into new markets, business world's changing. Well, do you have the right talent? Do you have the right talent with the right skills? If not, you need to start to make those investments. But without unearthing what those kind of skills and who you have on your roster, you're not going to be able to do that and make the right critical decisions to get ahead. And competitively, I think that's another thing that's kind of shined through with a lot of what you've said here is competitively, if other companies are using this technology, if they're leveraging data in this way, if they're using AI and you don't, how are you going to be able to compete against them? Because they've already become more efficient, they've scaled, they've met their future needs.
Absolutely.
And how can these leaders ensure their business and talent strategies are both fully integrated and aligned?
Yeah. So if you start with number one, just baselining the skills of your people, right? That helps you understand sort of where you are today. And then once you understand what the strategy is for the future, right, which is where do you want to grow, what are the sort of the directions that you want to take the company in terms of future initiatives, then you can also plot a chart towards understanding like what the skill gaps are, right, towards getting to the next milestone as a company. And that's where you can start to, if you chart out the future for the next couple of years, you start to now have an understanding of what investments you need to make as a company, right? So if you look at the horizon as a few years from out, it can actually change the way that you operate as a company, right? Which is, for example, like if you have a major initiative and you want to hire, let's say a few hundred salespeople that actually, can make that transformation happen for the company. You now have time to actually see whether you have a pipeline of people within the company that can potentially be molded towards taking on that role in the future. You can start to invest in, hiring the right people from the outside, or you can effectively start to mentor people from the inside, right? And this gives you the levers as a company to really make sure that your strategy, your people strategy, and your business strategy is actually fully aligned. And so that is, one of the benefits that comes from investing in tools like the talent intelligence platform, right? So the ability to really understand the present as well as the future, and then effectively from a business perspective, just make sure that your strategies from the people side and the business side are fully aligned.
And understanding what you have now and the future are two things that are very tied together, right? Because it's hard to understand how you can prepare for the future without understanding where you're currently at, right? It's almost like any consultant would say you got to assess your situation before you devise that future strategy. So I think those are pretty well connected as well.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, Sachit.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me, Dan.